Plus, we would love to know, think back to your college experience, right? Who was one person or what was one role that was important to your own success? And include that with your introduction. We're going to be building off of that during this session. Wonderful. Thank you, Abby, for getting us going. Welcome, welcome. Hmm. Hello, Dan. Welcome. So, all right. So we've got some wonderful. Um, let's see, we've got some faculty advisors, faculty mentors, faculty who took it on themselves. We're seeing a theme here. Professional mentors, graduate students. Awesome. All right. Seeing a little variety. Any others? All right. Well, please still keep introducing yourselves. I want us to use our time. Ooh, we got faculty members or mentors again. Um, so, um, as we get started here, I'm going to let my colleague Katie Locke introduce us, the Gardner Institute, and herself, and then I will introduce myself. So, Katie, take it away.
Thank you, Kristen. So, if you're not familiar with the Gardner Institute, we are just almost 28-year-old nonprofit located in Western North Carolina. Just our offices are in Brevard, North Carolina, but our staff are located all across the country. I'm calling in from Asheville, North Carolina, and I'll let Kristen tell you where she's calling in from later. But the Gardner Institute, our mission is to transform higher education, really focused on student-centered redesign, leadership development, institutional learning, and sustainable transformation. Our mission is to ensure that demographics like postcodes are not the number one reason that somebody, or not the number one predictor of whether somebody graduates or not. And I'd love to share my personal retention person was Dr. Herb Jackson at Missouri State University, or if you're familiar with it all, it was Southwest Missouri State back in my day. And some might say I was not super successful as an undergraduate. I struggled, I think, as many people do, um, in my first few years without much focus. And Herb Jackson was assigned as my academic or my faculty advisor. He said, "You are going to be a second semester junior and you don't have a major." And he sat down and looked at all the different things that I had done and said, "You should be a communications major." And he was very instrumental with me then in allowing me to do some research with him. And it was a great relationship we had for those last 2 years. So that
That's
is
awesome.
who I am, and I'll let Kristen introduce herself.
Wonderful. Thank you for that story, Katie. So I'm Kristen Seitz Trader. I'm Director of Program Design here at the Gardner Institute and the lead facilitator of the Retention Academy. My person came a little bit later, and you'll learn why here in a minute. But a little later in my career during my master's program, Dr. Jack Bushnell at UW Eau Claire encouraged me to go on for a PhD. And I had never, up to that point, had someone single me out for my aptitude for more advanced studies. until I'd met him. And that's what opened the door for me, right? That's when I started to really find my academic home. So, so sometimes, yeah, it's those faculty mentors that'll just nudge us along the way. And a lot of you mentioned that. But I also wanted to give a shout out to Tom, who shared it was also the people who hired me for my first on-campus student worker job, right? Like that is can be so important, right? And for so many students to be able to have that kind of opportunity on their campus. Oh, and Sabrina's a blue gold. Woo! That's awesome. Small world. All right. Well, so that's a little bit who we are, but let's talk retention. Now, most of us on this call likely already know a great deal about retention, right? You are already, leading those efforts. Yet I want us to shift our focus a bit from retention to understanding persistence and what it really means to enable students to persist to completion. Um, because that's where we get into what is actually happening then to retain them as persistent students here at our institutions. So, after all, retention is actually an institutional goal, right? It's about keeping the students you have at your institution till they graduate. But as research shows, persistence is the student's goal to reach their goals, their completion, their desired outcome, regardless of the institutions they pass through to get there. And I am actually one example of that. So, as an undergrad, I transferred multiple times looking for my academic home. Dropped out of my first institution, went to a community college, transferred to a state school, transferred again to finally end up at UW Eau Claire, which is also where I went back for my master's. Um, Now, I never doubted that I was going to get a college degree, right? I just didn't know it would take me 6 years and 4 institutions to do it, right? So I was determined to persist, but I was not retained by 3 different institutions, right? A large research school, a community college, and a small regional school. So, as representatives of institutions, this is the mismatch you are likely struggling with. You've got students who want to persist, who have the aptitude to persist. How do you help them persist where you are? So, I want us to step back and we're going to do another quick little interaction here. So let's step back and think about your own experience as a college student. Besides the person you've already noted or the faculty mentors and that campus job, what else during your student experience helped you persist during your college career? And so a Zoom poll should pop up here. Our colleague Brittany is running things behind the scenes for me. And so when that pops up, there it goes. Pick whatever actually applies. So you can choose more than one, but what helped you persist in college? Not surprising, I see relationships with faculty or staff showing up right away, given what some of you have already shared. All right. Look at that variety. Every single option was selected at least once. And of course, some of you chose more than one thing, right? And look, and it's interesting. So we think about sense of belonging, friends and peer networks, and relationships with faculty. All of those are those human relationships, right, that you have when you are a student. And it can make all the difference, right? So obviously there isn't just one winner here. We're all impacted by more than one factor in terms of our persistence. And that's the case for our students as well. So that's the point we're going to explore. Oh, I got something in the, maybe we see the results. Sorry, yes. Thank you, Sabrina. There we go. So this is what you all selected. Um, Thank you so much for participating in that. Um, but again, there are multiple factors that influence persistence, and that's what we're going to explore a little today. And that is the real driver behind the Retention Academy. So students persist because of an experience, right? It isn't just a single I mean, it might be a single person, right, Katie? Right? It could be. But oftentimes it's probably compounded by a variety of other things, right? The different experiences and relationships that reinforce or sometimes even compete with one another during a student's college experience. Of course, some of the student experience is beyond the control of our institutions, right? No matter how committed we are to student success, we cannot simply remove their caregiving responsibilities, their first generation status, their, whatever it may be that is over and above their experience at the institution, right? But we can do something about what happens when they are inside our institutions. A lot of the student experience is shaped by what we do as institutions and the systems we have in place. These systems are made up of various people, policies, and practices that each student encounters across their college journey. For instance, a student might seek out an academic advisor, right? But that advisor is also working within the constraints of institutional policies, growing caseloads, new technologies, or recently updated referral process, all of which shape their practice and thus their interaction with the student, right? Let's take another example, like financial aid. Financial aid at its most basic is funding, but when viewed as part of a system within the student experience, we can see that it is also experienced by students as different, shifting deadlines or office communication from the financial aid office, forms they have to complete, the timing of when staff can actually process those forms, and then not to mention all the various decisions at both the government and institutional level that are well beyond some of the control that any one of us on this call um, can influence. So, in other words, students don't experience a single office or a single person. They experience the connections among all of the different things that make up our institutional systems. And they experience the system we have, a system that has probably developed over time because of history, culture, habit, the technologies that were available, the government regulations that were in place at different times, or simply the phrase you probably all come to love and loathe, the way we've always done things, right? Those systems are designed perfectly to produce the results we are getting, including the retention disparities that probably motivated you to join us today. So, systems in our institutions are creating the conditions for persistence. So, of course, students bring their own goals, circumstances, backgrounds, responsibilities, strengths, choices. That's all still very true. But our institutional systems can make their likelihood of persisting easier or harder by creating the conditions for their success. If students are not persisting at our institutions, in other words, they're not being retained, then we have to ask ourselves, what about the student experience is making it harder for those students to persist? Unfortunately, the truth is that what's easier for one student might not be easier for another. Persistence and thus retention depends on the needs of the students themselves. So the question is, what do your students need to persist? So think of the students that you are struggling to retain right now. Write down a quick hypothesis about why they might not be persisting. Then, if you're comfortable with sharing, share it in the chat. And let's look at if there's some commonalities, some differences among your colleagues on this call. I'll take a minute to let you just sort of think about what would your hypothesis be in response to this question? All right, we've got Abby leading the way again. Thank you, Abby. Um, First semester performance is highly correlated with retention rates, and downstream, we identify academic preparation as the strongest indicator. Anybody else? All right, Sabrina. Hypothesis, there's a disconnect between what students need and how their services in and out of the classroom are being provided. Good. You're already thinking systems wise, which is awesome. Nancy, thank you, Nancy. Consistent and supportive learning environments inside and outside the classroom. Now, of course, what I'm hearing and seeing is it's very similar to what all of us needed when we were persisting, right? All right, Jessica, thank you for sharing. Yeah, lack of a clear path, struggle to find their way and make connections, and like the institution doesn't really care. Yeah. Uh, the aspect of caring is so important and is something that we have not spent enough time dedicating ourselves to in higher ed. So if these are your hypotheses, right? Oh, Tom, awesome. Thank you. Non-persistent driven by unresolved logistical financial friction. Yeah, that goes uncaught without a proactive follow-up touch point. And the capacity to provide that touch point, right? Capacity always being such a critical element of this. So in the academy, we would take a hypothesis like one of these, and then really the next question is, what would you need to learn to test this hypothesis, right? You think you're knowing like, I think I know why we're losing students. We just need to figure out what the solution is. Well, the Gardner Institute's approach is we need to dig into the data. We need to dig into what's really happening and getting at those root causes. So what would you need to learn to test this hypothesis? What evidence would you need to collect, right? And not just quantitative data, but qualitative. Who would you need to talk to? Who on your campus has the expertise to tell you what it looks like? And hint, the students are part of that answer, right? And then what parts of your institutional system would you need to study? And that's by truly embracing the idea that it is an entire system that is impacting these things, right? So, and I would even say, I would go back to you, Abby, I'm going to use yours as an example. So identifying academic preparation as the strongest indicator. In a lot of situations, that would be, oh, well, the student just isn't ready. But nowadays, we are increasingly seeing the need for colleges to be student ready, right? And really what that means is, what can we do on our end of things to help that student persist, even if they don't come in with the level of preparation that previous generations of students had, right? Those are the kinds of questions. Well, what do we do to figure out the solution? We have to learn about the students. We have to know what they're experiencing and what matters. And then the ultimate question that we ask here at the Gardner Institute is, how would you design a system that makes it easier for all students to persist, right? Regardless of whether or not they're showing up in some of your most, critical numbers. So in the academy and in pretty much all the work we do here at the Gardner Institute, we view retention as a systemic, evidence-informed outcome of an intentional design, right? So retention when we talk about ensuring that students are going to reach completion and earn a meaningful degree, we have to look at what's making that possible in your institutions, in your systems. So retention, in short, is an outcome. It's a design outcome that we need to lean into and see what are the factors we can influence, right? Those of us who are practitioners in the institutions to make a difference. So the three key elements that we focus on is first, seeing the whole system, right? Here, we're not just going to focus on the student characteristics, whatever background or information, background and preparation they are coming in with, but and not just individual programs or offices either. Many of you probably are sitting in such offices, right? The Office of Student Success. But we know true success requires more than a single office to be doing that work. So we need to be able to map the conditions that are currently helping or hindering a student persistence across their whole experience. And then, as I mentioned, we follow the evidence, not just to find out who is leaving, but to understand why they are leaving. This means learning about what students are actually experiencing at our institutions and where they are encountering barriers, especially those students we're struggling to retain the most. And then it's about finding opportunities for change, right? Finding those leverage points within the system where change can be most impactful. So by connecting our map of the system with our knowledge of the student's experience, we can zero in on places where changing a policy, a practice, a relationship, a process could meaningfully redesign that experience to support student persistence. Oh, no problem, Nancy. Thanks for stopping in. Remember to watch the recording. So that is really the backbone of our approach at the Gardner Institute and is the focus of the Retention Academy. So during the Academy, we introduce you to this process, right? It's a 5-week boot camp, if you will, right? But what we try to do is give you some of the tools to think about the kind of system you need to be designing that, when fully implemented, should improve student success, persistence, and retention. So I am going to hand off to Katie here to walk you through the details of the Academy to help you make your decision about enrolling. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kristen. Really appreciate that insight into the Academy and really getting us thinking about what retention looks like in our current state. It's certainly different today than it was back when I was a student. And if you can just move ahead the slides, I'm going to go over a little bit about how the Retention Academy works and give you some of those details. And then at the end, I'll go through how you can register to join the Retention Academy. I did want to emphasize that this is an academy for a team. So we know that retention doesn't happen, as Kristen said, in one office. So we really offer this to bring a team together so that the team can address your chosen retention issue. So you will begin to map your current retention system. So really understand what's out there. It is amazing to me that when you bring different people from different parts of your institution together, sometimes there are things that we're just unaware of, different people duplicating efforts. Start to, as Kristen was talking about, identify the evidence to gather on your student experiences. What is it that you need to know in order to best address the student's needs? Explore the possible root causes of attrition. And then identify some opportunities for changing the system and thinking about who needs to be involved, what might that take, Is there additional information you need? Building support across the institution. We've had some schools do sort of a road show where they've gone around to different departments and talked about whether it's data or retention or first year, and really sharing with the rest of the campus what they know and what they're learning in order for everyone to sort of be on the same page. And then building that practical plan for what you want to do next. And so how do you benefit? So that shared vision of student success and retention is really critical. I was earlier this week working for 2 days with an institution, and as I walked around and listened to the different groups talking, that vision or definition of student success came up all the time. And the leadership at that school was saying, well, everybody knows what our definition of student success is and retention, but they didn't. Whether the provost thought that everybody knew, clearly the people in the room did not have that clarity. So having that shared vision and really talking through what that means in this context is a really beneficial experience. You'll have greater confidence in leading evidence-informed change. So as Kristen said, what do you need to make those decisions? And now we'll support you in making sure you have the information and you can apply it to this particular set of challenges. What are the practical methods to implement immediately? Whenever we do, whether it's retention or something else at the Gardner Institute, we find that institutions always go, we could do this, this, and that, just like this. So finding those things, those quick wins, and that can really be impactful. Again, that collaboration across institutional divisions and that preliminary action plan to guide your retention efforts going forward, because we know it's not a one and done, right? You're not going to do one thing. I hate to disappoint, but we do not have a magic wand that is going to make all of your retention problems go away. So who should be on your team? So again, it's important to have a diverse group of people, senior administrators, faculty, staff, and students are very important to have on your retention team. And so we've given you some suggestions here: academic advising, student support, institutional research, financial aid, enrollment management, all of these different sort of areas. And you'll know sort of who are the champions on your campus who will really want to delve in and do this work. A lot of times institutions already have a team in place, and that's even better because we can help you just really kick off and get that work done quickly. So the Academy experience, there are 5 virtual sessions, all on Wednesdays from 3 to 4:30 Eastern Time. The dates are listed here, the first one being October 7th. These are all recorded, so if you are unable to attend one, you can you will have the recording. One of the questions people frequently ask is, what is the time that you will require outside of the course? And we usually find that the teams who are highly implementing and super effective are meeting in between each one of these meetings separately so that they can sort of delve into the work. There are 5 corresponding online modules with guidance and resources. Kristen and the team will be working with you, team meetings between sessions, and a plan for a quick win retention project or a plan to go a little bit more in depth. And our Academy facilitators. So Kristen is the lead facilitator, and Dr. Vicki McGillen, who is on vacation, and so she is not here with us today. Vicky has had deep, deep experience in this work and brings a lot of experience as a provost and in a variety of other roles at campuses across the country. So you're in very, very good hands, two real deep experts in this field. So, how do you join? The first question people always ask is about the fees. So, the fees are listed here. They are based on your undergraduate enrollment as determined by College Navigator. And I just want to be super clear that this is the fee for the institution, not per individual. And we can split those fees into 2 fiscal years if that is helpful. One of the things I always like to point out, especially when we're talking about retention, is that for most institutions, the fee is covered by one student being retained. And in our experience, institutions who work with us have a much higher rate of retention than that. So you would definitely, it will pay for itself very, very quickly. The registration deadline is September 28th. Tomorrow you'll receive an email from us. It will have the recording of today's session, the slides from today, and it will include a link for you to register your interest. And then somebody from the Gardner Institute will be in touch with you and talk about how you can pay for this. So September 28th, again, is the deadline. So we would really love to see you all joining us in the Retention Academy. I do know that there are a number of transformation schools. If you are in our transformation process, this is not something that you would pay additional for. It's part of the bundled package that you've already paid for. So, Kristen?
And really, we just, if there were any other questions, love to open this up as a conversation for those of you who are still here. Happy to answer any other questions you might have. You're welcome, Abby. Thank you so much for joining us. You're welcome. All right. Thanks. Yep. Go talk to leadership. See if you can swing this. We would love to have you join us and have this conversation more.
And if you need, if it's helpful to have one of us talk with your provost or a team and give you sort of an overview of the process, we would be happy to do that. As I said, we'll send out the recording. There will be 2 more info sessions, I think, coming up. And I should know the date off the top of my head, but I do not. But we'll include that in our follow-up email. So if you have other colleagues who you think would benefit from attending, you'll have that information. It will be the same. So unless you want to hear Kristen and I again, you may not want to come back, but we're happy to have you. But it is the same. Oh, thank
Oh,
you,
good.
Brittany.
Thank you, Brittany. Yes, August 25th, 3 p.m. Eastern. We'll do this again. Oh.
So what if I turn off the recording, and then if anybody's around wants to ask a question that you don't want recorded for all to hear, you have that opportunity.
I also enabled video and audio, so if you'd like to turn on your video and ask on screen, you could do that now.
Thank you, Brittany.
Thanks, Brittany.